Tom had been dreaming about retirement for years. Not the kind where you sit around watching TV all day, but the kind where you finally get to do what you love without anyone telling you when or how. For Tom, that meant fishing. He'd spent 32 years working as an accountant, crunching numbers in a windowless office, and the whole time he'd been planning his escape to somewhere peaceful. He must have looked at 100 properties over 3 years. Some were too close to the highway. Others had neighbors practically on top of each other. A few had ponds, but they were either too small or too murky. Tom knew exactly what he wanted, and he wasn't going to settle. His wife had passed away 4 years earlier, and his kids were grown with families of their own. This purchase was for him, and it had to be perfect. Then one Thursday afternoon in March, his real estate agent called with excitement in her voice. She'd found something special. The property was 5 acres with a natural lake in the back corner. Half an acre of clear, spring-fed water surrounded by willow trees and cattails. Tom drove out that same evening, and the moment he saw it, he felt something click into place. The lake sparkled in the late afternoon sun, and he could already picture himself sitting on the bank with a fishing rod in his hand. The property was part of a newer community called Meadowbrook Estates. The houses were spread out nicely, not like those cramped subdivisions where you can hear your neighbor sneeze. There was an HOA, which made Tom pause for a second. He'd heard horror stories about homeowner associations from his brother-in-law, but the agent assured him this one was pretty laid back. They just handled the entrance landscaping, maintained the streets, and organized an annual summer barbecue. The fees were reasonable, and the rules seemed simple enough. No purple houses, keep your grass under 8 inches, don't leave your trash cans out all week. Standard stuff. What really mattered to Tom was the lake. The agent pulled up the property survey on her tablet and showed him the boundaries. The lake was entirely on his lot, fed by an underground spring that had been there for probably 100 years. The deed confirmed it was his and his alone. Not shared, not community property, just his. Tom could barely contain his excitement as he signed the papers 3 weeks later. The first thing Tom did after moving in was stock the lake. He called a guy who specialized in pond management, and they spent an afternoon discussing what would work best. They decided on largemouth bass, bluegill, and a few catfish. The guy explained how the ecosystem would balance itself, how the smaller fish would keep the insect population down, and how the bass would keep everything in check. Tom hung on every word like a kid learning about dinosaurs. Over the next few months, Tom transformed the lake area into his personal paradise. He built a small dock that stretched about 15 feet into the water. Nothing fancy, just pressure-treated wood with a nice bench at the end. He bought the materials from the local hardware store, and the owner's son helped him haul everything on a Saturday. They finished it in 2 days, and Tom felt a sense of pride he hadn't experienced in years. This was his, built with his own hands. He planted wildflowers along the bank and set up a comfortable chair under the biggest willow tree. Early mornings became his favorite time. He'd wake up at sunrise, make a thermos of coffee, grab his tackle box, and head down to the dock. The world was quiet at that hour. Just the sound of birds waking up and the occasional splash of a fish jumping. Tom would cast his line and wait, enjoying the peace more than anything else. The fishing was better than he'd hoped. Within 6 months, the bass had grown nicely, and he was catching keepers regularly. Tom practiced catch and release most of the time, carefully unhooking each fish and watching it swim back into the depths. But every couple of weeks he'd keep a few for dinner. There's something special about eating a fish you caught yourself, cooking it on the grill with lemon and butter, sitting on your back porch knowing you're living the life you always wanted. His neighbors seemed friendly enough. The Johnsons lived on the left, a younger couple with 2 kids who were always running around their yard. They'd wave whenever they saw Tom heading to the lake. On the right was an older woman named Helen, who kept to herself but had the most beautiful rose garden Tom had ever seen. Behind his property ran a walking path that connected to the community park. People would stroll by in the evenings, and Tom would sometimes nod hello if he was out by the lake. Everything felt right. Tom had his routine down perfectly. Coffee at sunrise, fishing until about 9, then breakfast. He'd spend the middle of the day working on little projects around the house or reading on his porch. Late afternoon meant another session at the lake, especially in summer when the bass were most active. His son visited one weekend with the grandkids, and Tom taught 7-year-old Jake how to cast. The boy's face lit up when he caught his first bluegill, and Tom felt his heart might burst with happiness. The HOA sent out a monthly newsletter that Tom mostly skimmed. They announced things like the dates for the annual yard sale, reminders to trim trees away from power lines, and updates about the community entrance project. Tom paid his dues on time, kept his property neat, and figured that was the end of his obligations. He'd been to one HOA meeting when he first moved in, just to introduce himself. But it was boring talk about budget allocations and landscaping contracts. He never went back. What Tom didn't know was that someone had been watching him, not in an obvious way, but noticing, taking note of his daily fishing trips, his dock, his peaceful routine. Someone who saw problems where Tom saw paradise, who saw violations where Tom saw his own private property being used exactly as he pleased. For 6 months, Tom lived in blissful ignorance. He'd wake up excited for each new day, grateful that he'd made the leap into retirement, proud of the sanctuary he'd created. The lake had become more than just a fishing spot. It was his therapy, his meditation, his reward for 3 decades of hard work. Sometimes he'd sit there without even casting, just watching the water and feeling thankful. He had no idea that his perfect retirement was about to turn into a nightmare. No clue that his simple pleasure of fishing in his own lake would soon involve violation notices, threats, and police cruisers in his driveway. Tom was just a man who wanted to fish in peace, and he was about to learn that sometimes the most unreasonable conflicts come from the most unexpected places. It was a Saturday morning in early October, one of those perfect fall days where the air is crisp and the sky is so blue it almost hurts to look at. Tom was sitting on his dock with his favorite rod, a cup of coffee beside him, watching his line drift in the gentle current. He'd already caught and released 2 nice bass, and he was thinking about keeping the next one for lunch. Life didn't get much better than this. Then he heard footsteps. Not the casual stroll of someone on the walking path, but deliberate, angry footsteps coming right onto his property. Tom turned around to see a woman marching down toward his dock like she was leading an army into battle. She was maybe 60 years old, wearing a crisp white blouse and khaki pants that looked like they'd been ironed that morning. Her gray hair was pulled back so tight it made her face look even more severe. In her hands, she clutched a clipboard like it was a weapon. Tom set down his rod and stood up, ready to say hello. He figured maybe she was lost or needed directions. But before he could get a word out, she started talking. More like yelling, actually. Her voice was sharp and loud enough to scare away every fish in the lake. She introduced herself as Beverly, the president of the Meadowbrook Estates HOA. Tom had heard the name before but had never actually met her. She'd been out of town during that one meeting he'd attended. Right away, Beverly launched into a speech about violations and community standards. Tom just stood there completely confused, trying to understand what she was talking about. According to Beverly, his fishing activities were creating an eyesore. An eyesore. Tom looked around at his peaceful lake, his simple wooden dock, and wondered if they were seeing the same thing. She went on about how his daily fishing trips were disrupting the natural aesthetic of the community. Tom tried to interrupt, tried to explain that this was his own private lake, but Beverly just talked right over him. She had a way of speaking that made it clear she didn't care about anyone else's opinion. Then she moved on to the dock. His beautiful dock that he'd built with his own hands. Beverly called it an unauthorized structure that violated community guidelines. She said it was ruining the natural landscape and that several neighbors had complained. Tom wanted to know which neighbors, but Beverly ignored the question. She just kept reading from her clipboard, listing violations like a prosecutor at a trial. Tom felt his blood pressure rising, but he kept his cool. He pulled out his phone and opened the Photos app where he'd saved a copy of his property survey. He zoomed in and showed Beverly the clear boundary lines. The lake was entirely on his property, every single inch of it. The spring that fed it was his. The dock was his. Everything was his. He explained this as calmly as he could, even though his hands were shaking a little. Beverly barely glanced at the phone. She waved it away like Tom was showing her a picture of someone's vacation. She insisted that all property within Meadowbrook Estates fell under HOA jurisdiction for aesthetic purposes. It didn't matter if the lake was technically on his lot. The community had standards and he was breaking them. Tom couldn't believe what he was hearing. He'd checked all this before buying. His real estate agent had assured him the lake was his to do with as he pleased. That's when Beverly pulled out a piece of paper from her clipboard. It was printed on official HOA letterhead, and she thrust it into Tom's hands like she was serving him court papers. The document was titled, Notice of violation in bold letters at the top. Tom scanned through it quickly. According to this paper, he was being fined $200 per day until he ceased all fishing activities and removed his dock. $200 a day. Tom did the math in his head. That was over $6,000 a month. He looked up at Beverly, searching for some sign that this was a joke. But her face was stone-cold serious. She informed him that he had exactly 10 days to comply. Remove. The dock stop fishing and restore the area to its natural state. If he didn't, the fines would start accumulating, and the HOA would take legal action to collect. She said legal action like it gave her pleasure. Tom tried one more time to reason with her. He explained that he was retired, that fishing was his passion, that he'd bought this property specifically for the lake. He mentioned that he'd reviewed all the HOA documents with a lawyer before purchasing, and there was nothing in there about private lakes. Beverly's expression didn't change. She told him that the board had recently updated their interpretation of the covenants, and this new interpretation gave them authority over all water features within the community. Tom felt like he'd stepped into an alternate reality. He asked to see these updated interpretations. Beverly said they were available in the HOA office during business hours, Monday through Wednesday, 2 to 4 in the afternoon. Tom pointed out that was only 6 hours a week and asked if she could email them to him. Beverly said the HOA didn't do email for official documents. Everything had to be reviewed in person. The conversation was going nowhere. Tom took a deep breath and told Beverly that he'd review his HOA documents again and consult with his lawyer. He said this firmly but politely, making it clear he wasn't going to just roll over. That's when Beverly's face turned red. Not just pink, but actually red, like a thermometer about to explode. She stepped closer to Tom, pointing her finger right at his chest. She told him that this community had standards, that everyone had to follow the rules, and that people like him who thought they were special were the problem. She said she'd been HOA president for 8 years, and in all that time, she'd never seen such blatant disrespect for community guidelines. Tom wanted to point out that he'd been following the actual rules perfectly, but there was no getting through to this woman. Beverly turned to leave but stopped at the edge of the dock. She looked back at Tom with something that could only be described as triumph in her eyes. She told him that this wasn't over, that he'd regret not cooperating, and that she'd make sure the entire board knew about his defiance. Then she marched back up toward the street, her footsteps just as angry as when she'd arrived. Tom stood there, holding the violation notice, his coffee now cold, his peaceful morning completely destroyed. He looked down at the paper again, reading through the absurd demands. Remove a dock on his own property. Stop fishing in his own lake. It was insane. He'd worked his whole life, saved carefully, bought this place fair and square, and now some power-hungry HOA president was trying to take away the one thing that made him happy. He sat back down on his dock, not to fish, but just to think. The bass he'd been hoping to catch for lunch didn't seem important anymore. Tom pulled out his phone and called his lawyer, a guy named Robert who'd helped him with the property purchase. It went to voicemail. Tom left a message explaining the situation and asking Robert to call him back as soon as possible. The rest of the weekend was ruined. Tom couldn't stop thinking about Beverly's visit. He pulled out all his HOA documents and read through them again, page by page. There was nothing about lakes, nothing about fishing, nothing that gave them authority over what he did on his own private property. The covenants talked about house colors, lawn maintenance, and shared community spaces. His lake wasn't a shared space. On Monday morning, Robert called back. Tom explained everything, and Robert asked him to scan and email the violation notice. After reviewing it, Robert laughed. Not a happy laugh, but the kind of laugh you make when you see something so ridiculous you can't quite believe it's real. He told Tom not to worry, that the HOA had absolutely no legal standing and that Beverly was way out of line. But Robert also warned him that people like Beverly don't give up easily. She'd probably escalate things, maybe call more meetings, maybe try to turn the other residents against him. Robert suggested Tom start documenting everything, every interaction, every conversation, every piece of paper the HOA sent. Tom agreed and started a folder on his computer titled HOA Conflict. 2 weeks went by. Tom decided Beverly was bluffing and continued his normal routine. He went fishing every morning just like always. He figured once she realized he wasn't backing down, she'd move on to bothering someone else. His lawyer had confirmed he was in the right, and that was good enough for him. He had no idea how wrong he was. Beverly wasn't bluffing at all. In fact, she was just getting started, and her next move would be so extreme that Tom would question whether he was living in America or some kind of authoritarian nightmare. The confrontation on the dock was just the opening act. The real show was about to begin. It was a Wednesday morning about 2 weeks after Beverly's visit. Tom was back at his dock doing exactly what he'd been doing for months, fishing in his own lake. The sun was just climbing over the trees, casting golden light across the water. He'd caught a nice catfish about 20 minutes earlier and was debating whether to call it a morning or try for one more. That's when he heard the sirens. At first, Tom thought they were passing by on the main road about half a mile away. Emergency. Vehicles went by sometimes, heading to wherever they were needed, but these sirens were getting louder, not fading away. Tom set down his rod and stood up, confused. Then he saw them. 2 police cruisers turning onto his street, lights flashing red and blue. Tom's heart started pounding. Had something happened? To one of his kids? Was there an emergency in the neighborhood? The cruisers pulled right up to his driveway, and Tom started walking quickly toward his house. That's when he realized they weren't there for an emergency. They were there for him. 2 officers got out of the first car, and another one from the second. They weren't running or looking panicked. They were walking with purpose, hands resting, near their belts in that way cops do when they're not sure what they're walking into. Tom raised his hand slightly, a reflex from watching too many news stories about things going wrong during police encounters. The lead officer was a tall guy, maybe in his 40s, with a mustache and tired eyes. He called out to Tom, asking if he was the property owner. Tom said yes, his voice shaking a little despite having done nothing wrong. The officer asked for identification. Tom pulled out his wallet slowly, very aware that all his neighbors were probably watching this scene unfold. He could see curtains moving in windows across the street. The officer looked at Tom's driver's license, then at a notepad he was carrying. He explained that they'd received a report about trespassing and illegal fishing on community property. Tom felt like he'd been punched in the stomach. Trespassing? Illegal fishing? He was standing on his own land, fishing in his own lake. This had to be a mistake. Tom's voice came out stronger now, fueled by disbelief and anger. He told the officers this was his property, that the lake was entirely on his lot, and that someone had clearly made a false report. The second officer, a younger woman with blonde hair pulled back in a tight bun, asked if he could prove ownership. Tom said absolutely, and asked if he could get some documents from his house. The officers nodded, and one of them followed Tom inside while the other 2 waited by the lake. Tom's hands were shaking as he pulled out his property deed from the filing cabinet. He also grabbed the survey map and his closing documents. Everything that proved this land was his. As he turned to head back outside, he saw Beverly walking across his yard like she owned the place. She must have been waiting nearby, probably watching for the police to arrive. Outside, Tom spread the documents on the hood of one of the police cruisers. The lead officer put on reading glasses and examined everything carefully. The survey map was especially clear, showing the property lines and the lake entirely within Tom's boundaries. The deed listed Tom as the sole owner, with no easements or shared rights mentioned anywhere. While the officer was reading, Beverly started talking. She had that same aggressive tone from before, insisting that Tom was stealing community resources. She claimed he was running an illegal fishing operation, and that the lake was meant for viewing only, not personal use. The female officer held up her hand and told Beverly to wait, but Beverly kept going. She said Tom had been warned that he'd refused to comply with HOA guidelines, and that he was a menace to the community. The lead officer looked up from the documents. His expression had changed from cautious to irritated. He looked at Beverly and asked her directly if she had any documents showing the lake was community property. Beverly stuttered for a second, then said the HOA covenants gave them authority over all water features. The officer asked to see these covenants. Beverly said they were in the HOA office and she didn't have them with her. The officer took off his glasses and rubbed his eyes. Tom could see the man was frustrated. The officer explained in a very calm but firm voice that this was clearly a civil dispute between Tom and his HOA. It was not a criminal matter, and it was definitely not trespassing. The property documents made it crystal clear that Tom owned the land and the lake. Unless Beverly could produce documents right now proving otherwise, there was no crime being committed. Beverly's face went through several shades of red. She insisted the police needed to do something, that Tom was violating community standards, that this couldn't be allowed to continue. The female officer stepped in and told Beverly something that made Tom's heart soar. She said that filing false police reports was actually a crime, and if Beverly continued to waste police resources on civil HOA disputes, she could face charges herself. The air seemed to go out of Beverly right then. Her shoulders dropped and her mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. She tried to recover, saying she was just trying to protect the community, that she had every right to call the police if she suspected illegal activity. The lead officer cut her off. He told her that suspicion needed to be based on facts, not personal disputes, and that she should handle HOA matters through proper legal channels, not emergency services. The officers apologized to Tom for the inconvenience. They handed back his documents and told him he was free to continue fishing whenever he wanted. It was his property, his lake, his right. As they were getting back in their cruisers, the lead officer turned and gave Tom a sympathetic look. He said quietly that HOA disputes were the worst, and he wished Tom good luck dealing with it. After the police left, Tom expected Beverly to leave too. But she didn't. She stood there in his yard, staring at him with pure hatred in her eyes. Tom met her gaze and asked her calmly to leave his property. Beverly pointed her finger at him, shaking it like a teacher scolding a child. She told him this wasn't over, not by a long shot. The HOA board would be hearing about his defiance at an emergency meeting she was calling. She'd make sure everyone in the community knew what kind of person he was. Tom felt his temper rising but kept it in check. He told Beverly she was welcome to call all the meetings she wanted, but it wouldn't change the fact that this was his property, and he had every right to fish here. He suggested she spend her energy on actual community issues, like the broken gate at the entrance that had been stuck half open for 3 weeks, or the potholes on Maple Street that were getting worse every day. That comment seemed to make Beverly even angrier. She spun around and marched off his property, pulling out her phone before she even reached the street. Tom could hear her talking loudly to someone, probably another board member, her voice shrill and angry even from that distance. Tom went back to his dock, but his hands were still shaking. He sat down and tried to calm himself. The morning that had started so peacefully had turned into a circus. Police at his house. Accusations of crimes he didn't commit. A woman so determined to control him that she'd abuse emergency services to do it. Tom had never been in any kind of serious trouble in his life. He'd never even gotten a speeding ticket. And now he had police reports filed about him, even if they said he'd done nothing wrong. He called his lawyer, Robert, right away. Robert answered on the second ring, and Tom poured out the whole story. The police, Beverly's accusations, the threat of an emergency HOA meeting. Robert listened quietly, and Tom could hear him typing, probably taking notes. When Tom finished, Robert let out a low whistle. He said Beverly had crossed a line by calling the police, and that might actually work in Tom's favor if things escalated further. Robert told Tom to document everything that had happened. Write down the exact time the police arrived, the officers' names from their badges, what everyone said. Get copies of any police reports if possible. Robert also said Tom should absolutely attend that emergency HOA meeting, and Robert would come with him. It was time to set the record straight in front of the entire board and any residents who showed up. Tom spent the rest of that day writing everything down. Every detail he could remember from Beverly's first visit and from this morning's police incident. He felt like he was building a case for trial, which wasn't far from the truth. He also called his son and told him what was going on. His son was furious and wanted to drive over immediately to confront Beverly, but Tom talked him down. The last thing he needed was his kid getting arrested for threatening an HOA president. That evening, Tom sat on his back porch with a beer, looking out at his lake in the fading light. The water was calm and peaceful, like none of the day's drama had happened. A bass jumped near the far bank, creating ripples that spread out in perfect circles. Tom wondered how something so simple, fishing in his own lake, had turned into such a nightmare. The letter about the emergency meeting arrived 2 days later, sent by certified mail, so Tom had to sign for it. The meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday at 7 in the evening at the community center. The letter demanded Tom's appearance to address his continued violations and refusal to cooperate with community standards. It was signed by Beverly and 2 other board members Tom had never heard of. Tuesday couldn't come fast enough. Tom was done being pushed around. He was done being polite to people who were trying to take away his rights. It was time to fight back, and he was ready. Tuesday evening arrived faster than Tom expected. He'd spent the previous days preparing, going through his documents with Robert, making sure every piece of evidence was organized and ready. Robert had put together a presentation on his laptop, complete with property maps, deed information, and highlighted sections of the HOA covenants. They were going into this meeting armed with facts, and Tom felt more confident than he had in weeks. They arrived at the community center 15 minutes early. Tom wanted to get a feel for the room before things started. What he found shocked him. The parking lot was nearly full, and when they walked inside, the main meeting room was packed. There had to be at least 40 people there, maybe more. Folding chairs were set up in rows, and almost every seat was taken. People stood along the walls, and Tom could hear the buzz of conversation filling the space. Robert leaned over and whispered that this was actually good. More witnesses meant more accountability. Tom nodded but felt his stomach doing flips. He'd never been comfortable with public speaking, and now he was going to have to defend himself in front of what looked like half the neighborhood. Beverly was at the front of the room, setting up a laptop connected to a projector. She wore a navy blue blazer that made her look even more official, and her expression was pure determination. 2 other board members sat at a long table beside her. One was an older man named George, who Tom had met briefly at that first meeting months ago. He seemed uncomfortable, fidgeting with his papers and avoiding eye contact with everyone. The other was a woman in her 50s named Ruth, who kept whispering to George and looking concerned. At exactly 7 o'clock, Beverly called the meeting to order. She banged a gavel on the table like she was a judge, and the room fell silent. Beverly began by thanking everyone for coming to this important emergency meeting. She said the board had called this gathering to address a serious matter affecting the entire community. The way she said it made Tom sound like a dangerous criminal. Then Beverly launched into her presentation. The projector lit up with a photo of Tom sitting on his dock fishing. Tom recognized it immediately. It was from about 3 weeks ago. Early morning, based on the light. Beverly had been spying on him, taking pictures without his knowledge. More photos appeared on the screen. Tom casting his line. Tom reeling in a fish. Close-ups of his dock from different angles. It felt invasive and creepy, seeing himself displayed like this in front of all these people. Beverly narrated each photo with dramatic flair. She talked about unauthorized structures and commercial fishing activities. Commercial? Tom almost laughed out loud. He was one guy with a fishing rod catching maybe 3 fish a week. Beverly claimed his activities were disrupting the natural environment and lowering property values. She said multiple neighbors had complained about the eyesore, though she still refused to name anyone specific. The presentation went on for nearly 20 minutes. Beverly showed slides about community standards and the importance of maintaining aesthetic harmony. She read selected portions of the HOA covenants, carefully choosing bits that talked about maintaining property appearance and respecting community guidelines. She made it sound like Tom was running some kind of industrial operation instead of just enjoying his retirement. Finally, Beverly concluded by saying that Tom had been given multiple opportunities to comply. He'd received official violation notices. He'd been warned about the consequences. And yet, he continued his activities with complete disregard for the community. She recommended the board vote to impose maximum fines and pursue legal action to force compliance. Then she sat down, looking satisfied with herself. The room was silent for a moment. Tom could feel everyone's eyes on him. Some people looked sympathetic, others looked confused, and a few looked like they'd already made up their minds that he was the bad guy. George, the male board member, cleared his throat and asked if Tom would like to respond. Beverly tried to interrupt, saying they should vote first, but George surprisingly stood his ground. He said it was only fair to hear both sides. Tom stood up and Robert came with him to the front of the room. Tom's heart was pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears, but once he started talking, something clicked. Maybe it was anger, or maybe it was just knowing he was right, but his voice came out steady and clear. He thanked everyone for coming and said he appreciated the chance to set the record straight. Then he nodded to Robert, who pulled up their first slide. It was the property survey, blown up large enough for everyone to see clearly. Tom pointed to the boundaries, tracing them with his finger. He showed exactly where his property lines were and where the lake sat. Entirely within his lot, not 1 inch on community property. Robert clicked to the next slide, showing the property deed. Tom explained that he'd purchased this land fair and square, and the lake came with it. It wasn't a community lake. It wasn't a shared resource. It was his private property, fed by a natural spring that had existed long before Meadowbrook Estates was even built. He'd done his homework before buying, made sure everything was legal and proper. Then Robert displayed the actual HOA covenants, not cherry-picked sections, but the complete relevant pages. Tom read through the sections about property maintenance and community standards. Yes, the HOA had rules about keeping your lawn neat and painting your house appropriate colors, but nowhere, absolutely nowhere, did it mention anything about private lakes or personal fishing activities. Robert had highlighted every section that dealt with property use, and none of them applied to what Tom was doing. Tom addressed Beverly's claim about commercial fishing directly. He said he was a retired accountant who enjoyed fishing as a hobby. He caught maybe 2 or 3 fish a week, usually releasing them back into the water. He'd never sold a single fish, never advertised fishing access, never charged anyone a dime. It was just him, alone, enjoying his own property in the most peaceful way possible. As for the dock being an unauthorized structure, Tom pulled out the building permit he'd obtained from the county before construction. He'd done everything by the book. The county had approved it. He'd followed all local building codes. The HOA covenant said nothing about needing HOA approval for structures on private property that weren't visible from the street. His dock was behind his house, visible only to people using the walking path, and even then barely noticeable through the trees. Robert then showed a timeline of events. Beverly's first confrontation, the violation notice with impossible demands, the police being called under false pretenses. Tom didn't sugarcoat it. He said Beverly had abused emergency services, wasted police time, and caused him enormous stress over something that was completely within his rights as a property owner. The room had gone completely silent. People were leaning forward in their seats, really listening now. Tom could see some folks nodding, their expressions changing from skeptical to sympathetic. He wrapped up by saying he'd bought this property to enjoy his retirement in peace. He wasn't hurting anyone. He wasn't breaking any rules. He just wanted to fish in his own lake on his own land, which he'd worked 32 years to afford. When Tom finished and sat down, the silence continued for a few seconds. Then a woman in the back row stood up. Tom recognized her as one of the people who walked past his lake sometimes. She asked to speak, and George nodded. The woman said she'd lived in Meadowbrook for 5 years, and she'd watched Tom at his lake plenty of times. It was peaceful and pleasant, she said. She didn't understand what the problem was. If anything, it made the neighborhood feel more like a real community, seeing someone actually enjoying their property. Then another person stood up, a younger guy Tom had seen jogging on the path. He said the same thing. He'd never seen anything wrong with Tom's fishing. It wasn't bothering anyone. He asked Beverly directly who had complained because he'd talked to several neighbors and nobody seemed to care. Beverly's face went red, and she said she couldn't reveal names due to privacy concerns. A man near the front, someone Tom didn't recognize, raised his hand. He said he wanted to talk about priorities. The entrance gate had been broken for a month. The potholes on 3 different streets were getting worse. The community park's playground equipment was rusty and needed replacement. Why, he asked. Was the HOA spending time and money going after someone for fishing in their own lake when there were real problems that needed attention? That opened the floodgates. Multiple people started talking, some calling out from their seats. Someone mentioned the landscaping at the entrance looking terrible. Another person brought up the fact that the annual budget meeting kept getting postponed. A woman asked why the HOA was paying for a lawyer to go after Tom when they couldn't afford to fix basic infrastructure. Beverly tried to regain control, banging her gavel repeatedly, but people were fired up now. Ruth, the female board member, looked extremely uncomfortable. She leaned over to George and whispered something. George nodded and held up his hands, asking for quiet. When the room settled down, he said the board needed to discuss this privately for a few minutes. He asked if they could take a short recess. Beverly looked like she wanted to argue, but Ruth was already standing up. The three board members went into a side room, and the community center erupted in conversation. People came up to Tom, shaking his hand, apologizing that he'd been put through this. His neighbor Helen, the woman with the rose garden, squeezed his shoulder and told him she thought the whole thing was ridiculous. The Johnsons from next door said their kids loved watching Tom fish and hoped he'd teach them someday. Robert looked pleased. He told Tom quietly that this was going better than expected. The board had clearly overreached and the community was pushing back. Tom felt a weight lifting off his chest. For the first time in weeks, he felt like maybe, just maybe, this nightmare might actually end. After 15 minutes, the board members filed back in. Beverly's face was tight with barely contained anger. Ruth looked relieved. George just looked tired. They sat down and George spoke first. He said the board had reviewed all the evidence presented tonight, and they needed to be honest with the community. They'd made a mistake. George's words hung in the air for a moment. A mistake. Tom could see Beverly's jaw clench, her knuckles turning white as she gripped the edge of the table. But George continued, his voice steady despite the tension. He explained that after reviewing the property survey and deed that Tom had provided, along with the actual HOA covenants, it was clear the board had no authority over Tom's private lake or his fishing activities. The violation notice should never have been issued. Ruth nodded in agreement and added that she'd been uncomfortable with the situation from the beginning. She admitted she hadn't actually seen the property documents before voting to pursue action against Tom. She'd trusted Beverly's interpretation of the situation, and that was a failure on her part. She apologized directly to Tom, looking genuinely remorseful. The room erupted in murmurs, people turning to each other with surprised expressions. Beverly finally spoke up, her voice sharp and defensive. She insisted she'd been acting in the community's best interest, that she'd received complaints and that someone needed to enforce standards. George cut her off gently but firmly. He said that enforcing standards was important, but so was following the actual rules and respecting property rights. The board had overstepped and they needed to make it right. The vote was quick. George and Ruth voted to rescind all violations and fines against Tom immediately. Beverly voted no, but she was outnumbered. George then made another motion, one that clearly caught Beverly off guard. He proposed that the HOA reimburse Tom for any legal fees he'd incurred defending himself against these baseless accusations. Ruth seconded it immediately. Again, Beverly voted no, but again she lost. Then something unexpected happened. A man Tom didn't know stood up and addressed the board directly. He said his name was Dennis and he'd served on HOA boards in 2 other communities before moving to Meadowbrook. He said what happened tonight was a perfect example of what happens when board members act without proper oversight or accountability. He made a motion from the floor to hold a special election for the board president position within 60 days. The room went silent. Ruth surprised everyone by seconding the motion. She said that given everything that had happened, the community deserved a chance to decide if the current leadership was taking them in the right direction. George looked uncomfortable but didn't object. The motion passed by a show of hands from the community members present, with only a handful voting against it. Beverly stood up so fast her chair fell backward. Her face was dark red, and for a moment Tom thought she might actually explode. She grabbed her papers and her laptop, shoving them into her bag. She said this was a witch hunt, that she'd given 8 years of her life to this community, and this was the thanks she got. Nobody tried to stop her as she stormed out of the community center, the door slamming behind her hard enough to rattle the windows. The meeting wrapped up quickly after that. George announced that he'd send out an official letter to all residents within the week, clarifying the situation and outlining the plans for the special election. People started filing out, but many stopped to talk to Tom on their way out. They apologized for not speaking up sooner, for not questioning what Beverly had been telling them. Some admitted they just assumed Tom must have done something wrong if the HOA president was that upset about it. The Johnsons invited Tom over for dinner the following weekend. Helen asked if she could bring him some tomatoes from her garden. A retired teacher named Walter asked if Tom would mind if he brought his grandson by sometime to see the lake. Tom said yes to all of it. feeling overwhelmed by the sudden warmth after weeks of hostility. Robert shook Tom's hand and said he'd send over an invoice for his legal services, which the HOA would now be paying. He also said Tom should be proud of how he'd handled himself. A lot of people would have given up or gotten angry, but Tom had stayed calm and let the facts speak for themselves. That made all the difference. Tom drove home that night feeling like a huge weight had been lifted off his shoulders. He'd won. Not just the dispute, but something bigger. He'd stood up for himself against someone who'd tried to bully him into giving up something he loved. And the community had backed him up when it mattered most. The official letter from the HOA arrived 5 days later. It was signed by George and Ruth, and Beverly's name was notably absent. The letter explained that there had been a misunderstanding regarding Tom's property rights, that all violations and fines were rescinded, and that the board apologized for any distress caused. It also announced the upcoming special election and encouraged residents to consider running for the board if they wanted to help shape the community's future. Attached to the letter was a check reimbursing Tom for his legal fees. It wasn't a huge amount, maybe $1,500, but it was the principle that mattered. The HOA was admitting they'd been wrong and making it right. Tom went fishing that next morning with a lighter heart than he'd had in months. The sun was just rising, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. The water was perfectly still like glass. He cast his line and settled into his chair, breathing in the cool morning air. This was what he'd bought the property for. This peace, this simple joy. About an hour later, he heard footsteps on the path behind his property. Tom tensed for a second, old habits from the past month kicking in. But it was just Walter, the retired teacher from the meeting with a boy about 10 years old. Walter waved and called out, asking if this was still a good time. Tom waved them over, smiling. The boy's name was Christopher, Walter's grandson. His eyes went wide when he saw the lake, and he asked Tom about 100 questions in the first 5 minutes. What kind of fish lived there? How deep was it? Had Tom ever caught anything really big? Tom answered each question patiently, enjoying the kid's enthusiasm. It reminded him of when his own son was that age, full of curiosity and wonder. Tom spent the next hour teaching Christopher the basics of fishing: how to bait a hook, how to cast without tangling the line, how to be patient and wait for the fish to bite. When Christopher finally caught his first bluegill, a small one that fought harder than its size suggested, the boy's face lit up like Christmas morning. Walter took about a dozen photos, and Tom helped Christopher carefully remove the hook and release the fish back into the water. After they left, Tom sat back down on his dock. More neighbors started stopping by over the following weeks. Some just wanted to chat. Others were curious about the lake. A few asked if they could fish sometimes, and Tom always said yes as long as they were respectful. His private sanctuary was becoming something more, a quiet gathering spot for the people in his community who appreciated nature and simplicity. The special election happened 2 months later. Beverly didn't run, and nobody was surprised. Tom heard through the neighborhood grapevine that she'd put her house up for sale and was moving to a retirement community in Florida. A younger couple, both engineers who'd moved in about a year ago, ran for board positions and won. They immediately got to work on the actual problems plaguing the neighborhood. The entrance gate was fixed within 3 weeks. The potholes got filled. The playground equipment was replaced. Tom even volunteered to help with a community fishing day they organized at the retention pond in the main park. He brought extra rods and tackle and spent a Saturday teaching kids and adults alike how to fish. Seeing families enjoying themselves, kids running around excited about catching minnows, reminded Tom why he'd moved here in the first place. Community wasn't about rules and restrictions. It was about people coming together and enjoying life. 6 months after the whole ordeal ended, Tom was sitting on his dock on a perfect spring morning when his phone rang. It was George from the HOA board. Tom's heart sank for a second. Old anxieties kicking in, but George quickly reassured him everything was fine. He was calling to let Tom know the board wanted to do something. They were putting together a community newsletter highlighting residents, and they wanted to feature Tom and his lake in the first issue. They wanted to tell the story, with Tom's permission, as an example of how the community had learned to handle conflicts better. Tom thought about it for a minute, then agreed on one condition. He wanted the story to focus not on the conflict, but on what came after, on how neighbors had come together, how the community had fixed real problems, and how his lake had become a place where people could connect with nature and each other. George loved the idea. The newsletter came out a month later. There were photos of Tom fishing, of Christopher catching his first fish, of the community fishing day at the park. The article talked about property rights and HOA responsibilities, but mostly it talked about community, about respecting each other, about standing up for what's right, and about how something negative can turn into something positive if people are willing to learn and grow. Tom kept a copy of that newsletter on his refrigerator. Every morning when he grabbed his coffee before heading to the lake, he'd see it and smile. He'd fought for his right to fish in peace, and he'd won. But more than that, he'd helped his community become a better place. The lake that had almost been taken from him had become a symbol of something bigger, a reminder that sometimes standing your ground isn't just about winning. It's about showing others that doing the right thing matters even when it's hard. These days, Tom's dock sees a lot more activity than it used to. There's still plenty of time for quiet mornings alone with his thoughts and his fishing rod. But there are also afternoons when neighbors stop by, evenings when he teaches kids to cast, and weekends when Walter brings Christopher over to try for that big bass they've been chasing all summer. Tom had wanted a peaceful retirement, and he got it. Just not in the way he'd expected. It turned out peace wasn't just about being alone. It was about being part of a community that respected you, supported you, and grew together. And every time Tom cast his line into his own lake, the lake he'd fought so hard to keep, he felt grateful not just for the property, but for everything that had come from standing up for it.